Thank you, Angela, for allowing me the opportunity to speak to your students.
My name is Shikha Singh, and I'll be your lecturer for this talk. I am the Invasive Species Coordinator for the JLW CISMA, which stands for Jackson, Lenawee, Washtenaw Cooperative Invasive Species Management Area. Before we get to what invasive species are, I would like to ask you a question.
Before we get started, let's talk about what makes Michigan a wonderful place to live in. What are some words and activities you would use to describe Michigan to someone who lives outside of Michigan? I'll give you a few seconds to think of some words.
The first thing that pops into my mind is beautiful natural resources, parks, rivers, streams, places to canoe, fish, and hunt. As our state motto says, pure Michigan. Michigan has a diverse landscape that includes over 35,000 inland lakes and 49,000 miles of rivers and streams. Currently, Michigan is home to over 20 million acres of forest land. The Forestry Service has identified more than 50 forest types in Michigan on the basis of its classification system. Only 23 of those forest types occupy more than 1% of the total forested area. We also share an international refuge with Canada. The refuge consists of 48 miles of Detroit River and has 6,000 acres of islands, coastal wetlands, marshes, and shoals.
We have a variety of species that are found across the state, including several fish that are important to the recreational tourism industry. The Great Lakes commercial, recreational, and tribal fisheries are collectively worth more than $7 billion annually, supporting more than 75,000 jobs. The Great Lakes itself supports 139 native species, with some species such as yellow perch and sunfish being fish that many recreational anglers are happy to catch and fry up for dinner. In addition to commonly found species, we also have a variety of unique ones as well. The Hines emerald dragonfly is endangered, with adults laying their eggs in small streams, in fens, and sedge meadows. After hatching, the aquatic larvae spend up to 5 years in wetlands before completely maturing and emerging as adult dragonflies. Pitcher's thistle is native to the sand dunes shorelines along the upper Great Lakes and is also considered a threatened species. Piping plovers are an endangered shorebird with only between 75 and 80 nesting pairs in the entire Great Lakes area. The eastern Massasauga rattlesnake is found near wet prairies, marshes, low-lying rivers, and has been listed as a threatened species. It is an important species that provides important pest control services, and they come in both the brown and tan color, as well as in a black color with an oily-like sheen when you look at them in the sun. They are pretty shy and want to stay away from people, so give them their space if you come across them. If their habitat changes too much, they either move elsewhere or can't find a partner. And they often return to the same hibernation site or area each year. And if they can't find a suitable place to hibernate, research has found that they are unable to survive the winter. Finally, freshwater mussels are one of the most endangered groups of animals in North America. They are very sensitive to pollution and temperature, and a recent review of the U.S. and Canadian American Fisheries Society, they found that 97 of the 292 species that occur in the United States are considered endangered. Michigan has several mussel species that are federally listed as endangered or are candidates for federal listing, with 31 of the 43 mussels found in Michigan being listed by the state as threatened or endangered, or are considered species of special concern. 2 of these have likely been extirpated from the state.
Michigan has a variety of unique species of animals and critical habitat worth protecting. However, that biodiversity is being threatened. The term biodiversity is derived from the word bio, meaning living, and diversity meaning variety. Hence, biodiversity is a number of different plants and animals in an area. As you can see in this map, biodiversity tends to increase as you approach the equator. On a global basis, the two great destroyers of biodiversity are habitat destruction and invasion by exotic species. An invasive species is one that is not native and whose introduction causes harm or is likely to cause harm to Michigan's economy, environment, or to human health. Invasive species won't necessarily be limited by the same constraints as native species, such as temperature, soil characteristics, and elevation. However, when a new invasive species appears, it may be able to thrive under a variety of conditions. Those invasive species may also lack a predator to keep its population in check.
There are two ways invasive species can get here. The first way is that people brought them here intentionally. There are a few reasons for this. One could be that the invasive species is tasty, like the red swamp crayfish, and people want to be able to catch them and eat them for dinner. Another reason is that people think a plant or a tree is very pretty and want to grow it in their yard or put them in their pond, not realizing it may escape from the pond when it floods or via wildlife, becoming a problem elsewhere. People will also dump their aquarium if they can no longer care for it or they have to move. Some of you may have also had classroom aquariums and had a nice ceremony at the end of the year of releasing the contents into a nearby lake or stream because nobody wanted to take care of them during the summer. This is also the case for terrestrial aquariums. People release things like frogs and turtles, which may or may not have diseases as well.
Invasive species can also accidentally appear at a new site. Examples include heavy machinery traveling from one construction site to another, motorboats and kayaks that have vegetation draped all over its engines, the wheels, and trailers. Some of these plants can actually survive out of water for a couple of days, especially if the conditions are right, if it's dark and damp. Anglers and hunters can also spread invasive species if they don't clean off their waders or their hunting gear as they move from one spot to another. Even if you're just going for a walk in a park or taking your dog for a stroll. If your dog was like mine, sometimes they would disappear underneath a bush or behind some hedges and emerge covered with burrs and seeds. And if these dogs are anything like mine, when it came time to going inside, once you got home, my dog would do anything he could to avoid going inside, often running around the backyard. As you can see, this is another way for these kinds of invasive species to drop off and go from a public area to a private residence.
90% of the world trade is carried by sea, and it's an important mode of transportation. Authors of a study mapped the itineraries of 16,363 cargo ships during the year 2007 and created a network between ports. The yellow color, or the lightest color, represents the routes used the most, with darker lines representing routes with less traffic. So basically, there are a ton of shipping vessels like this moving across the sea, and they have brought in a variety of invasive species to the Great Lakes region. One of the most classic examples of aquatic invasive species being brought in relates to ballast water in ships. Ballast water is fresh or salt water held in the ballast tanks and cargo holds of ships. It is used to provide stability and maneuverability during a voyage, or when ships are not carrying cargo, not carrying enough cargo, or when navigating rough seas. Ballast water may also be used to add weight so that a ship will sink low enough in the water to pass under a bridge and other structures. If it helps, you can think about putting heavy bags of sand or kitty litter in the trunk of your car during winter to decrease the chance of your small car from slipping off the road under icy conditions. Usually ballast water is pumped into the ballast tanks when a ship has delivered cargo to a port and is departing with less cargo or no cargo. Ballast water is then transported and released at the next port of call when the ship picks up more cargo. So, if a ship is receiving or delivering cargo at several different ports, it will release or take on water at each port, and thus the ballast tanks will contain a mix of water originating from different places, even different countries, depending on where it's coming from. It's interesting because historically, most shipping to North America utilized solid ballasts instead of water, which was less likely to introduce aquatic invasive species. So in this picture, you can kind of see these little green organisms are floating around in the ocean or whatever water body. So as the ship is getting rid of the cargo, it needs to take on more weight. So it's pumping in that water. And then you can see those little organisms have been sucked up and now they're traveling with the ship. And once it reaches its destination, it's going to load the cargo on. So then it's going to be too heavy. So then therefore it must release some of that water that it had from before. And these little green organisms have now been kicked out. And the cargo hold is full and it goes on to its next port. So now that you know what ballast waters are and we've talked about ships, you can kind of picture all this activity and movement on our oceans. Niagara Falls served as a natural barrier for species dispersal and prevented ships from reaching the upper Great Lakes areas. To allow ships to bypass this barrier, the Welland Canal was constructed and opened in 1829 and enlarged in 1919. By opening up the shipping industry, this allowed cheaper and faster distribution of goods in that it opened up more distribution options. To further capitalize on the economic benefits of the shipping industry, the St. Lawrence Seaway was opened in 1959, which increased shipping traffic within the Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence Basin. As we previously discussed, this allowed for the introduction of invasive species from a variety of countries. Zebra mussel was first discovered in the Great Lakes in Lake St. Clair in June of 1988. While zebra mussels can stick to the hulls of boats, the salinity of the ocean would not allow for them to survive the journey, so ballast water is the usual suspect for how they got here. And if you look in this picture, you'll notice that this is where the Niagara Falls are located, and all of these little numbers are showing where the different locks are that the boats will navigate through as they move up this area. These authors did a telemetry study of fishes and found that fish could reach other lakes in the Welland Canal. They tagged and released fish from 10 species and found that 3.9% moved from the canal into Lake Ontario or Erie, and 0.6% moved through the flight of locks of the canal. So while unlikely, it is still possible. But this study does not mean that other species, such as the larvae of mussels, can't passively move within the water. So given the map of the shipping industry, how invasive species invaded via the North American examples I talked about above, to the surprise of nobody, look where the major areas of invasive species are. The larger reddish-brown dots are the areas that have the most invasive marine species. The blue arrow indicates traffic from Northwest Atlantic. Red is from the Northeast Atlantic, and green is from Asia. Now that invasive species are here, how can they negatively impact the environment? One way is it can outcompete the native species, and they can do this in a few different ways. If it's a plant, they can germinate earlier than the native species and prevent the native species from germinating because they're blocking the sunlight. If it's an aquatic plant that floats, it can grow in a mat and it blocks the sunlight from reaching the bottom of these lakes and ponds. Invasive species can also be very generalistic in nature. They can tolerate a wider variety of conditions, such as fluctuating temperature, soil acidity, or even elevation. They can also prevent other species from growing nearby. We call this allelopathy, and they can secrete chemicals that inhibit the growth of other plants. In a more direct manner, invasive species can kill or maim the native species, and this could be as a result of competing for common habitat or actually consuming them for their own nutritional requirements. All of these ways contribute to a reduction in biodiversity. One example includes purple loosestrife. Purple loosestrife is a plant, and in this picture you can see that the entire shore is covered with this one plant, and it used to be full of diverse native plants, allowing for different animals such as birds and insects to flourish. However, once it outcompetes and gets rid of those native plants, other native species may have to move to find the food that they require or habitat because they can no longer live in a purple loosestrife monoculture. As a result of invasive species moving into a new area, they can actually change the environment. They can cause erosion, eliminate critical food sources for native species, bring in diseases, and change the movement of water. There are also economic considerations. They can come in and they can damage your house, your structure, or businesses. There could be a decrease in tourism dollars flowing to a community that is traditionally dependent on tourists coming in to fish or hike or take pictures of endangered birds for their photo album. Invasive species can also inhibit the movement of animals such as deer, which could impact places where people want to go hunting. It can outcompete fish that people want to catch, and it could also decrease your property value. So for example, if you bought a nice waterfront property and you're used to sitting on your chair looking at the sunsets, and then a few years later that entire view is covered with Phragmites, it can actually decrease the amount that your property is worth. And what I think is more important, your time and money. You're going to have to spend a lot of time and money addressing these invasive species once it makes its way to your property, when you could be using that time and money on yourself. There are also several ways that invasive species can impact people's health, directly and indirectly. One way is it reduces visibility along roads and lakes. So if you're driving, you may not see an oncoming car, or if you're boating, you may not see if someone is swimming just around the corner. Physical injury is another thing to consider. Nobody wants to walk on a beach and step on zebra mussel shells or have an allergic reaction or a burn when they brush up against a plant. Flooding is also another thing to consider. As invasive species, mainly terrestrial ones, or shore species like Phragmites, come in, they can plug up an entire area and change how water is absorbed into the wetlands, and it can prevent it from getting absorbed and result in flooding. And that could also go back to economic concerns, damage your house, or if it's severe enough, it can cause drowning. During the summer, some invasive species can dry up and send all their energy to their roots, leaving all this dry brush above ground. This could be a fire hazard. And then finally, in aquatic systems, you could run into entanglement issues if you have long, reedy plants that inhibit or prevent the movement of children, pets, or anyone. So now that we know a little bit about invasive species, let's actually take a look at a few species on our radar. The first one I want to introduce you to is called Phragmites, or common reed. This plant is literally found everywhere. Wetlands, ditches, in a pond, around a pond, by the side of the road. It could be found in the middle of a farm field. It literally grows everywhere. It can grow up to 18 feet tall. It can outcompete native vegetation, and it eliminates critical habitat. A lot of birds will like a little bit of Phragmites because it offered some protection, but when it spreads to the point where it takes over everything, some birds have a difficulty in actually taking off or landing in these Phragmites stands. During the summer months, when it gets really dry, the dead upper portion of the plant could become a fire hazard. Phragmites is considered a rhizomatous species, and what that means is it has a rhizome. Rhizomes are horizontal underground stems, and if you cut Phragmites in one spot, it'll stimulate or send signals to the rhizome to send out a shoot elsewhere. Phragmites can spread by animal or wind. It can be spread from landscape or construction equipment. People will actually like it because it's beautiful. It gives them some privacy on their lakefront property. So it's used as an ornamental species. And sometimes people will plant it thinking that, oh, this is a cool species, it'll help me. But in a few years, it will become a problem because it just really takes over everything. I provided you with a couple pictures of Phragmites from a couple different places. In the first picture, this was taken by a lake, and you can tell how thick and how dense this Phragmites patch is. And this one was taken by the side of a road. And in winter, you can still see that it's thick, it's tall, and it actually was preventing full view of oncoming traffic. And I'm 5'3", so you can actually get a sense of how tall these plants can get. And look at those seed heads. They're really fluffy, and they can disperse very easily in the wind. We do have a native Phragmites species, and they are kind of hard to tell. You have to have some experience. But the native ones, they have a glossy stem, feels smooth to touch, and it's typically like a reddish brown color in the lower part of the stem. The non-native ones, which is the ones that we see pretty much everywhere now, the stem feels rough, has ridges in the stem. It's green, but may have a little bit of red on the lower stem. One main thing is look at the seed heads. The native one, the inflorescence is thin, branched, whereas the non-native one is full and really branched out. And this picture just shows, the distribution of Phragmites, and it's, like I said, everywhere except for Arkansas. And I'm not really quite sure why it wasn't found in Arkansas, but it might be there now, as this map was generated in 2014. European frogfit is an aquatic invasive species. It is a free-floating plant that can also root in shallow waters. Its leaves are easily identifiable as they are green and kidney bean shaped, and they range in width from 1/2 inch to 2.5 inches in width. It has 3 white petals and a yellow center. These turions, when they drop, they can result in a new plant in the next growing season. European frogbit has been found in Michigan. It's widespread along the coastal areas of Lake Erie and Huron, all the way up to the eastern Upper Peninsula, and has been found in some inland lakes and ponds in southeast Michigan. We recently discovered some sites in the Jackson-Washtenaw area, more in the Waterloo Rec areas that we're trying to address. It prefers slow-moving waters, but it has also been found in the slow meandering sections of the Grand River. It can spread in a couple different ways. Recreational activity, the boats and kayaks, swimming, they can, take up some of these plants, it gets caught, or the water will, through wave action, dump it in the seating area. And therefore, when you take that boat to another area, you could inadvertently carry it with you. Aquarium trade is another way. People used to buy this plant just to provide, some cover for their fish. And if they were unable to care for this aquarium that they had, they would release the contents into a nearby lake or stream. There is an Amazonian frogbit that is legal to buy because it is thought that it won't be able to overwinter. And so therefore it won't, become a problem over time. We're still looking into this, but as of right now, the Amazonian frogbit is legal to buy, but European frogbit is not. The negative impacts of this species, it could change the flow of water. It can impact the boat traffic, especially if it clogs up your motors. It could eliminate important food and habitat that native species require. It could also reduce oxygen and light from reaching the bottom. I like to show this picture because it shows European frogbit in a couple different sizes. If you look in the top picture, you can see some larger leaves. And then in the second picture, it's not even half the size of my thumbnail. In the top picture, you can see that it's already becoming a problem. In this area, it's forming a mat and it's preventing sunlight from reaching the bottom. Parrot feather is another popular aquarium plant that prefers or lives in slow-moving waters. It's a freshwater plant. It is bright green and it has feathery leaves. It can grow 1 foot above water, and the submerged leaves may be a little bit reddish brown. All plants in the United States are the female version, and they can form dense mats and are spread by stocking and people dumping their aquariums. So this slide shows a couple different pictures of parrot feather. In this one, you can see how long one stem can get. Here's some brown reddish material that's been submerged. A close-up of the plant itself, bright feathery. It's just absolutely gorgeous. I can see why people would want to have it in their aquarium, but once it gets here, it spreads like crazy. And the interesting thing about this, even one plant fragment, you cut it or drop it, if you're trying to pull it and it leaves something behind, it can grow into a new plant. So eradication is very difficult and often requires herbicide. Over time, parrot feather is spreading. You can see in 1890 we had one documented case over here, but then as the years go on, it's spreading until we've recently reached, a lot of sites. Again, it's probably partly due to the aquarium trade, people just dumping their aquariums, and once it gets into the system, it spreads very easily, especially if all it takes is a fragment to become a new plant. When I talk about red swamp crayfish, my colleagues from the South laugh at me and tell me I'm being ridiculous, as red swamp crayfish are delicious and we should be happy to have them. That's because they're native down south, but here they're not. They are dark, they have a reddish body, and they can range from 2 to 5 inches in length. One of the common features is bright red bumps. You can kind of see on their claws, on their body. Has an elongated head with a triangular rostrum. and it prefers permanent freshwater habitat. So it needs water, to survive. It won't do well in intermittent water systems. It can actually run through grass, so you might sometimes be able to see them scurrying on people's lawns. And that's actually how they were first identified in Michigan. Somebody said, I think there's a lobster running on my front lawn. For those of you who like to go to buffets, you may have already eaten these before. They're typically the bright red crayfish that you get. They're often used in crayfish boils. They are illegal to sell live in Michigan, but you can buy them pre-cooked and frozen. Their body color can range. I mean, I've seen lighter crayfish than this. This is pretty dark, but you can still see the telltale red dots. This is a female with her eggs. And this is a little bit more of a juvenile view. So they are found in retention ponds, gulf ponds. So they are around in certain parts of Michigan, so be vigilant. They can spread via bait release. And so what happens is people will sometimes get some crayfish from one river and use them for fishing bait. And when they're done fishing for the day, they'll probably just dump what they have into the water. And, then this invasive species has moved from one area to another. It can also, like I said, crawl on the land. It can move through lands and pipes. This used to be used in classrooms for a teaching exercise, so teachers would also have them in an aquarium and then release them at the end of the year. And some of the things that they do that's bad is that they'll introduce disease to the native crayfish population. They're aggressive, so they'll outcompete the native species, and they can cause erosion by digging these deep burrows called chimneys and then destabilizing those riverbanks. Marbled crayfish is a new species that was recently added to Michigan's invasive species watch list. This has many of the same negative impacts that red swamp crayfish has, although it has one unique difference. It can reproduce through parthenogenesis. It's the ability to self-clone. It has thought to have arisen when two slow crayfish imported from Florida for the aquarium trade in Germany mated. One possible explanation is that preliminary evidence shows that the marbled crayfish has 3 sets of 92 chromosomes and not the usual 2. While 2 of the 3 sets were virtually identical, the third is different enough that one researcher thought that it likely came from the mating of 2 slow crayfish from different regions of the world thrown together in an aquarium. One might have had an abnormal egg or sperm that retained 2 copies of its chromosomes instead of the usual single set that is found in egg or sperm cells. Analysis of the marbled crayfish DNA from across Europe and Africa further showed that all of these crayfish are clones with identical genomes. Also, all individuals are female, and females have the ability to lay up to 700 unfertilized eggs that can develop into genetically identical offspring. Now, I can't really offer you a generic description because, as you can see in this picture, there are 2 different phenotypes. In this one, you see a bluish color crayfish with some speckles. Some of them are a little bit orange. But then in this picture, it seems to be a darker bluish black color. And so, they look very different, but nevertheless, they are very problematic if they reach Michigan. Invasive species can also work together to Some of you may be wondering, why do I have some Star Wars pictures throughout my presentation? And the reason why is that it highlights the importance of scale. Many people are used to thinking locally. It's not a big deal if I go from my house to a neighborhood park or somewhere within my county. However, we'll notice in the movies that none of the characters decontaminate their spaceship as they go from planet to planet. And that idea resonates with us here. People may not pay too much attention in their local areas because it does look very similar. However, people travel to other states, they travel to other countries, and we really need to be vigilant in how we travel to make sure that we're not bringing an unwanted visitor with us. A good example that shows the impact of tourism and how recreational activities can spread invasive species. The New Zealand mud snail, which is from New Zealand, was originally found in Idaho Snake River in 1987. Currently, that same species is now found in 4 out of the 5 Great Lakes. So this begs the question, how many of you have visited an out-of-state national park? So some of these things you may have experienced seeing people bringing in all sorts of coolers and driving in with their RVs, and there's a potential for them to be bringing in weeds and insects and other things. Invasive species are also why we have strict border restrictions that address food and what you can and cannot bring, and also recognize that our species can be problematic elsewhere. Let's dig a little bit deeper into the issue of national parks. 25 national parks had 1 million plus recreational visitors. In a recent survey, 326 national parks filled out a survey, and 245 of the respondents said that they had 1,409 populations of 331 invasive species in the national park system. Out of those populations, only 150 of them were deemed under control. So 150 out of the 1,409 populations were under control. This results in declines in local mammals. One example is the Burmese python in the Everglades National Park. Research has shown that with their presence, the amount of small mammals have dramatically decreased. Other species that are found in most national parks nowadays include things like quagga mussels, zebra mussels, garlic mustard, and feral cats. No invasive species presentation can be complete without this invasion curve. What you see here is a graph that has 2 y-axis with one that shows area infested. The second y-axis shows control costs, and then we have time on the x-axis. So what we're seeing is that an invasive species that is recently introduced has a better chance of being eliminated at a lower cost. It takes less time to get rid of it, and it's cheaper. If an invasive species is allowed to fester and takes over an area, it becomes very difficult to control and manage for that species, and then it becomes very expensive. At this point, you may not be able to eradicate it, and you're just trying to tread water and protect key areas. Unfortunately, public awareness usually begins in the middle, and at this point, many species and many infestations are going to require intense management efforts and cost a lot of money, with the results seemingly not in our favor.
There are a couple simple things you can do to prevent the spread of invasive species. 1, you could check your clothing and gear for insects and seeds. You can burn firewood where you buy it, because sometimes you'll have insects hiding in the brush piles. If you see anything weird, report that sighting to either DNR or contact your local CISMA. If you have boats or canoes, please clean, drain, and dry them before leaving that area or going into another lake or pond.
Each state in the country does have its own rules and regulations with regards to invasive species. There are quite a few in Michigan, but a couple that I can highlight to give an example of include Part 413, the transgenic and non-native organisms of the Natural Resource Plan. You're not allowed to transport prohibited species, and recently an amendment was made so that watercraft equipment or watercraft trailers had to be cleaned and they have to be drained before they are allowed to be transported over land and before launching into another water body. There are a few others, but again, we will just kind of give a couple of examples here. There are also instances where states and federal governments will butt heads and have various disagreements. Recently, the previous administration wanted to implement a federal law on ballast water that preempted state rules, and this meant that states would lose the authority to adopt and enforce some of their own standards on ballast water discharges. And you can imagine that states were not very happy, but this is currently being discussed, and we'll see what the result of this will be. There are also instances where there are international disagreements. I found another case where the United States of America wanted the Commission to look at one of Canada's recent rulings where they wanted to restrict and change their ballast water agreements at different ports. And so usually there are some groups involved and that they discuss the rules to see if it's fair and then take action from there. Policymaking is not easy and it can get very complex, especially when you have to consider environmental, economic, historical, and social perspectives. And so then it becomes a situation of how do you balance what's right and fair or what's environmentally responsible. Given the money and the stakeholders' ability to advocate for themselves on issue, there can and often will be inequality. All of us have been in situations where the squeaky wheel or the loudest voice steamrolled their way into getting what they wanted. And so we really want to avoid that, and you can do that by ensuring that you're well informed and you make sure you invite a variety of stakeholders to any policy making meeting. Due to time constraints, I won't have time to get into these cases in too much detail, but I at least wanted to put it out to you how there are other considerations and perspectives that need to be taken into account when dealing with environmental challenges. In the first article, called Cottagers and Indians, the Battle Over Water Rights Near My Reserve, was an article written by a Canadian who was a member of the Indigenous community, and the title is the name of a play he wrote that is based on a real case facing his community. The case is about a battle between cottage owners and Indigenous communities members who want to seed the lake with a native grass that is important to their cultural and dietary lifestyle. However, it creates difficulty for those who want to boat or recreate in the area. The second example takes place in California, where the Native American community used small burns to control invasive species and brush. Historically, modern management and government used to disregard these practices, but now they are being incorporated into current management efforts. When addressing environmental problems, it's very important to assemble a diverse group of stakeholders and allow everyone to participate in the entire process, not just at the end. By creating policy and then inviting groups at the last minute or near the end of the process can create ill will and leave groups feeling unsatisfied with the process and the decisions made. As you graduate and head out into your professional careers, one thing I would really urge you to do is to take the time and learn about the various stakeholder groups around you and who you will be working with. Different communities address invasive species in different ways. I recently learned about some perspectives from the Indigenous community who take a spiritual approach to invasive species. It is said that if they are here, they are meant to be here, and that we should find a way to incorporate these species into our lives. So this is quite a different way of looking at invasive species. I also know that there are some great collaborations between local land managers and various cultural, sporting, and religious groups when it comes to addressing invasive species.
By now, you're probably frustrated with hearing about all these negative things that invasive species bring to our region. However, we also have species that are invasive in other parts of the world. For example, the American gray squirrel threatens the native red squirrel in the United Kingdom. The American bullfrog is a pest in countries such as France, Brazil, China, and even within USA in the western part. New England's American lobster appeared in Europe in 1999, and they have some diseases that can kill the native European lobsters or cause deformations to the shells, which reduces their market value. In 1946, Argentina relocated 20 Canadian beavers to Tierra del Fuego in the windswept archipelago of South America's tip. They really wanted to foster a strong fur trade, but unfortunately, the pelt industry never took off, and the beavers didn't have any predators like wolves and bears that could keep their population in check. And since then, their populations number about 200,000. Red swamp crayfish was intentionally released in eastern Africa in man-made wetlands. They were intended to control snails. However, the plan went awry when some of these red swamp crayfish escaped to natural areas. Also, not pictured on this slide, but largemouth bass have invaded freshwater ecosystems around the world. Although it's a feisty fish that makes for good sport, they have decimated native ecosystems and impacted native fish species.
Well, this brings us to the end of the presentation, and we've covered a lot of material. In short, Michigan has a lot of beautiful natural resources, as do a lot of the places where you may be originally from, whether you're from the East Coast, West Coast, the South, Canada, or another country. Every place has beautiful resources that they wish to protect, and many of them are pristine. However, there are locations that do have varying degrees of invasive species. And one thing that we learned is that once invasive species get into an area, immediate action needs to be taken to prevent it from becoming out of control. So with vigilance and care, we can prevent full infestations like what's happening in this mess of a picture from occurring. Remember, prevention is the best way to prevent invasive species from coming in. While we focused mainly on aquatic invasive species today, there are a lot of terrestrial invasive species that directly and indirectly influence the aquatic ecosystem and processes that we didn't cover. Some examples include native trees that are beneficial to fish because they provide shade. And there are other species of plants that take up nutrients so that it doesn't end up in the river every time it rains. If you have any other questions, please feel free to contact me. My information is listed below, or you can contact your professor, Angela, and she can pass on the questions and comments to me. I'd be more than happy to talk more about this. Thank you for listening, and I hope you got something out of it, and I hope you all also have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you.